Hello, BookTube. It's Tuesday, and that means Tag Tuesday, and I have a tag that's an original that I was tagged in by its creator, and I somehow flew under my radar. Or I'd have done it days ago, because it's fantastic. It is the ReRead Book Tag, created by Roz at Scallydandling About the Books. And I have it here on the trusty iPad. Actually, that probably deserves an update, doesn't it? This is indeed the trusty iPad. My original iPad 2 from a decade ago. That I originally retired. I retired it last year because I thought it didn't work anymore. I thought it wasn't taking a charge anymore. Something must have been in the charge port for the machine that was temporary, that was maybe, I don't know, blown away or liquid and dried up and blew away or whatever. There's nothing wrong with it now. I am still going to go online and order a new power cord for this iPad 2. And I already, as you can see, I already went online and ordered an armor casing for it. This is a 3-piece armor casing. So you have this rubberized back, and then you have a plastic frame, and also a screen protector, a plastic screen protector. And you just have to put it together. You just have to assemble it like that. But it is so rock solid. I don't know if you can make that out. It doesn't look like there's anything on this machine. It looks like you bought it this way. You'd never guess there was a machine inside here. Tremendous sense of weight and solidity to it that I just love. Of course, it was the source of a little drama because this thing is really hard to get on. Understandably, because it's supposed to be really hard to get off. And I sat there, and Frida was right next to me, and she was saying, "What are you doing? What are you doing? What's that? I've never seen that before." I was telling her, well, you're a dog. You're not going to understand what this is. But I was sitting there, and I was thinking, okay, since this is very, very tight, this is very hard to put on, it is imperative that everything be completely clean before you put it on, because you're stuck with whatever you're left with. I meticulously cleaned the screen. I meticulously cleaned the back of the screen protector. Then I wrestled the whole thing on, turned it on, and there was a hair right in the middle of the screen. And I thought, maybe you can ignore it? No way. You all know that already. You're probably the same way. There was no way I could ignore it. So I just had to wrestle the whole thing off and get that thing out of there. So now I have a relatively clean screen. And it's fully charged. I put a ton of books on this thing. All of you have been very generous sending me ebooks, so there are a ton of books on this machine. And I now have another iPad. That's fantastic. One of you sent me an iPad. I put out a call in case you had a spare iPad. A couple of you sent me iPads. One of you, very, very kindly, very sweet, sent me a first-generation iPad that doesn't update anymore. You can't do anything with it anymore. It doesn't have anything wrong with it. It still turns on, still holds a charge, but there's nothing you can do on it, except maybe take grainy pictures. Another person sent me an iPad Air, and I love it, absolutely love it, but now I also have this as well. So I have the tag here that Roz made, and it is wonderful. Not just for the questions, but for the way the questions open up to discussions. It has been an absolute joy to watch the responses. I hope this thing goes mega viral. I hope everybody does a video about it, because it's all about rereading. And question number 1 wants to know where on the rereading spectrum you fall. Do you never reread books? Do you sometimes? What percentage do you fall? She goes to all the time. Do you all the time reread books? Although I don't see how that would be possible, because then, well, not in terms of, you'd never add to your library if that were true. You'd be stuck with some arbitrary stopping point. But I had to think about this, because the first question is, let's assume you do reread if you're doing this tag. So where do you sit on the rereading scale from almost never to all the time? I had to think about this because I am dedicated to reading a huge representative proportion of the new releases in the 24 or so genres that I read in the American book market every year. So not what so many of my reviewing brethren say, which is, there's no way that anyone could get to it all. I have to content myself with reading just a tiny fraction of a speck of what's coming out. Not that. Instead, the opposite of that, where at the end of every reading year, I say, all right, well, this was the American mainstream publishing market, and I acquitted myself fairly well in a representative form reading from that market. Now, it's not possible to read anything more than a drop in the bucket, because it's 250,000 books in America alone that are published every year. If you cut that in half, for textbooks, instructional manuals, computer manuals, Bibles, that sort of thing. That still leaves you with far, far more books than anyone could read in a year. But you can also cut that number down as well. You can cut out all but the top 10 publishers, for instance. That gets rid of, that'll bring you down to, I don't even know, 80,000, 70,000, something like that. And of those 70,000, you can then get rid of artistic reprints, you can get rid of class reprints, you can get rid of updated versions of books, anything that goes into the combine for the end number, but that doesn't actually count as a general new release interest, a title of interest. You can cut that number down. You won't get it down to the number that I read every year, but you'll be a lot closer than when you started. And I like that feeling. And I've dedicated, that is what my reading is these days. That has not changed in 10 years. So you would think, if you look at that I do very little rereading. But it turns out, the more I thought about this question, the more I realized that I do an enormous amount of rereading. I have it pegged here at around 60%. But it's actually 60%, about 60% of the new releases that I read, I then reread. Anything that I think might be in the running for a review, anything that I think deserves a reread, I will go back to because I get them twice. I get an advance copy and then I get a finished copy, or at least in the old days I did. I still do tend to get 2 copies of every book. An advance copy of some kind and a finished copy of some kind. And almost invariably, I will have read the book already when I get the finished copy, and I will read it again. So there's still a large amount of rereading that I do, and that's just new releases. I go out and about, I get secondhand books at charity shops, at a church basement, and at the Brattle Bookshop here in Boston. And I don't get those just to fill my shelves, I get those to read. So I would say that the original number that I came up with for new releases might actually be true for my reading just in general. That 60% of the reading that I do is rereading, especially if you consider how many new releases I reread. One way or another, it's a large percentage. Question number 2, has that changed over your reading life? Well, yes, it has. In my 28 years, my reading topography has changed radically. Most, especially when it comes to the question of rereading, was the huge amount of time that I spent traveling. I no longer travel. I am here at Hyde Cottage in this little room, but I have spent huge amounts of time traveling. And when I did that, I had a set number of little books, a couple of little hardcovers and a bunch of mass market paperbacks. And that number never changed. The books never changed. They formed a tile. I could fit them together as a fake tile bottom to my footlocker. I just pound the last one in, and they would not move. I had to pry it out again. And that was perfect. I would make a tile floor on the bottom of my footlocker with those books, with the exception only of the one that I had loose that I was reading. And no matter where I went, hours and hours long train rides, days long train rides, days long, weeks long travel on the open ocean, travels overland on one various kind of animal or another, in the cars of friends or strangers, or just walking, camping, in every kind of environment, in every kind of biome, everywhere. Those books were my companions. I did not go to bookstores. I did not care about new releases. I did not read them. I only read those over and over and over again, just those books. So there have been times in my life when on the spectrum of rereading, I actually would be all the time. But I can't imagine doing that forever. I mean, I did that because I didn't want book acquisition or the book world to be when you're traveling, not on vacation, when you're actually traveling, when you're journeying on a long journey where you're not sure when you'll be back and you've got minimal stuff. One of the keys for me was always to minimize the number of active components. That's always how I put it. The number of active components at all in the picture. And one active component would be books. I didn't want to have to be thinking in the Masai Mara or on the steppes of Mongolia about what new book I need. I didn't want to be thinking about that. So I just removed books as an active component and had just my bookish companions. So during those periods, I was rereading constantly. That's all I was doing. And then when that travel would be over, when I would get that inner clock would go off and I would slowly wind my way back home, once I got back home and was all detoxed and had recalibrated for where I was and had bathed a few thousand times and whatnot, then I would go to a bookstore and replenish. But during traveling, I only reread. Question number 3. When do you reread? Maybe immediately after finishing a book, or not till years later, or when the mood strikes. Like I mentioned, in the last 10 years, when I reread a book has been out of my hands. It has been prodded by the industry, by the book industry. When I got a finished copy, I would suddenly be prodded to read the book again. Differently, to read it slower, more critically, pencil in hand. The first time I was almost always a kind of impressionistic thing. How does this read? What kind of an impression is this author making? What are your initial reactions? And the reason that I liked to preserve that, and still do, is because those are valuable things to address in a review. Readers are going to want to know that. Most readers of a review of a book that I write are not ever going to reread the book. So it's important to be able to capture that, and you won't get that if you're reading it critically, pencil in hand, borrowing down on every note and conjunction the first time. So usually the when was out of my hands. Usually I would read the book first, and then the reread would happen when the publishing world sent me a finished copy. Otherwise, if it's not that, then it would be just organically. It would be, is it suggested by some other book that I'm reading? Is it sticking in my mind? I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of times that I've finished a book and immediately started rereading it. I don't see the use in that, because in order for a reread to be of value, I would think that, we're going to get to this later in this tag, but in order for a reread to be of value, I would have to change a little, somehow. And so I've never really understood people that get to the end of a book and think, oh, I love that so much, I'm just going to read it again right now. Then question number 4 is, why do you reread books? And that is my reason, because I like to think that I'm constantly changing, that I'm constantly adding things, picking up things, deleting things, that my composite as a reader is changing subtly from day to day, and maybe my composite as a person as well. I like to think that I'm always learning and growing somehow, and that therefore when I reread a book, I will bring to it a different reader and get a lot out of it, hopefully a lot more out of it, certainly a lot of different things out of it. That has certainly been true in my life. I have gone back and reread books and thought, oh my God. I joke all the time that in the interval between when I read it first and when I'm rereading it, the author has made some significant changes. I joke about that all the time, of course, to spare myself, because it's really me that I'm talking about. It's that I missed a lot the first time. So that's why I reread, because the book stays the same, but the reader hopefully does not. Certainly that's been true in my case. I go back and get a huge amount of value out of rereading. Question number 5, how do you reread? Faster, slower, just the best bits? I try not to reread bits, because that seems to me to be just morbid. That seems to me to be a kind of fetish, that I'd rather not do that. I'd rather experience the book, even if I love it dearly, I'd rather experience it as a whole. But I do go back and reread bits, chunks, passages, chapters, that sort of thing. But I prefer to go back and reread the whole thing. And rereading is always faster for me than the original reading was. Even when I'm learning a lot from the book, even when I'm realizing that I missed a lot the first time, it's always faster. Because most books aren't always profound. Okay? So most books are filler. Most books are integumentary tissue. And I usually remember that from the first time I read it. So the rereading tends to go faster. I tend to be able to concentrate more on the tangled stuff, the complex stuff that the author is doing, which is why this doesn't eat a lot into my reading time. Rereading does. Although the more I think about it, the more I realize I'm rereading something every day. So maybe that percentage is too low. Question number 6. Who or what do you reread more specifically? Which authors or genres or individual books? I made a list of my foremost victims. Shakespeare, of course, and The Diary of Samuel Pepys. But I also have down here Lord of the Rings. I don't know how many times I've read Lord of the Rings. And Lord of the Rings is also a perfect example of something where I would go in and read just a bit. Just a bit here and there. trying not always to have it be the same bit. Although the number of times that I've read The Council of Elrond, I don't even know. I just have no idea how many times that is. But I also have down here Rudyard Kipling, and although that is the author, it is also mainly the Jungle Books that I've read just more times than I can count. And Sherlock Holmes, the stories of Sherlock Holmes, The Once and Future King by T.H. White, P.G. Wodehouse, just endlessly, just over and over again. These are, for me, the stable of books that are inexhaustible. No amount of rereading will ever exhaust them for me. They will always delight, and I will always see something in them that I didn't see before. I just reread, for instance, a Jeeves and Wooster novel that I'm surprised has not been canceled. I'm surprised that cancel culture hasn't got to it, because there's a frequent mention of Negro minstrels. And the punchline, if you want to have it, the comedic payoff at the end of the book involves Bertie Wooster wearing blackface and not being able to remove it at will. He is in search of butter, which is the ingredient that will remove the blacking from his face and hands. And another character also wears blackface, and you know that's all in service of comedy. There is no ill will, no animosity anywhere in the book at all. But at one point early in the book, I think the first time those black minstrels are mentioned, they are referred to with what the 21st century annoyingly calls the N-word. So I'm amazed that the book is still in print. I'm amazed that it hasn't been canceled. But I just reread that and learned a lot. Not specifically about that. I learned a lot about, for instance, the author, P.G. Wodehouse's big heart, which a lot of his friends commented on. They commented that he really doesn't have a malicious bone in his body. In looking at his biography, I could have wished that maybe he would have a malicious bone here and there for the Nazis. but one way or another, you look at a book like this and you see, yeah, this would have been a writer of Wodehouse's vintage writing this book in, I think, the 1940s. Those mentions of those Negro minstrels would have been not only distant and a little bit flat-footed, but also angry or racist, and they aren't in this book. But every time I go back to any of these things, I learn a lot. Absolutely learn a lot and love them. Absolutely love them every time. And also, those are books, but I could also mention comics, because Superboy comics and the Legion of Superheroes I have gone back to so many times. So many times. I don't have any idea how many times, especially the Legion. There's no adventure of the Legion that I don't know word for word. The planets, the spaceports, the official names, everything about it. I've read them so many times. Question number 7 is there a book that you found better when you reread it? This happens a lot. I'm going to mention, for this and the next question, I'm going to mention books that I just got recently and reread. It seems fitting that I should mention rereads for this question. But for instance, for a book that got better when I reread it just recently was Elizabeth Bishop, One Art, the big collection of her letters that I love more every time I read it. I found so much more in it this time. So many offhand literary judgments. This was a person who's just steeped in books. It's amazing. It struck me more this time, and then for a perfect example of why I reread, because the last time I read a huge chunk of One Art, in fact, this time I think I read it all in various sittings, but the last time I reread One Art, I was not a book critic. I was in between the two periods of my life where I had been a book critic, and I bet that a lot of that literary talk, that literary chatter just went right by me. So that I'd be willing to bet that if I went back in my reading journal for my reactions to One Art, the last time I read it, 20 or 30 years ago, probably one of my reactions would have been, this isn't literary enough. Because mainly I was probably looking for extended discussions of literary stuff instead of just realizing that it was the air she breathed. And I very much saw that this time. So it was a wonderful new experience, and I learned a lot. It was a different experience. That's why I love rereading, because I changed. I was able to bring a different brain, different eyes, different experiences to it. And the next question is the companion to that. Is there a book you found that you reread and it was worse? And this is also something that I just reread, An Edge in My Voice by Harlan Ellison. The science fiction author Harlan Ellison had a couple of regular columns that he wrote for, and there's a lot of it in the Essential Ellison, and this is An Edge in My Voice is a collection exclusively of those columns. And I liked it a lot. Again, for someone who breathed books and writing and reading. But this time around, unlike last time, I noticed a lot in it that I had missed or that had just blown by me the last time I read it. which is how easy a lot of these pieces are, and how mean a lot of them are. I'd missed both of those because they're so bristlingly intelligent and so eloquent that I'd missed a couple of those. I'd missed the strength of those two aspects the last time I read this collection. This time, if anything, the book went down in my estimation because because I have changed. The last time that I read this, I had only written a column once. And it was very unfamiliar with how it's done, very unfamiliar with the kind of gimmicks you can do to get a column out of the week or whatnot. And now I have done it quite a bit and written a huge amount otherwise, a huge amount of reviews and essays and whatnot. And having had that life of a working author that I hadn't had when I read the book originally, I can see what Ellison is doing with much greater clarity, and it doesn't reflect well on him a lot of cases. So that'd be a case, an Edge of My Voice would be a case where the rereading was lesser. And then the final question, which one book have you reread the most times? I looked back at that list that I gave, and I was thinking about it, and I realized that the winner is the same as Noah gave on Everyone Who Reads and Must Converse. Hands down, the winner is the King James Bible. Hands down, easily. By several orders of magnitude over the others. I have read the King James Bible, I don't even know how many times. The whole thing from front to back, the whole thing in sequence, and books, chapters, authors, storylines. I have mined, and it's like Noah said, it's been the companion of a lifetime. Endlessly. Just the only rereading, even Lord of the Rings, even Superboy, that rereading is not endless. I know that there is a finite number of times. I have no idea how much I have lived with the King James Bible. None whatsoever. That is an endless reread, and I think always will be. And that is the ReRead Book Tag. The last thing to do is tag people, but this tag has been going the rounds, and people have been tagging 24 people at a time. So I don't know who hasn't been tagged, and I don't want to tag people twice. If you ever reread books and you haven't been tagged on this, especially if you're a new BookTube channel, jump into this conversation, because I want to hear answers from everybody. I tag anybody who rereads who has not been tagged on this, because it's fantastic. These are great questions. And I want to thank Roz for tagging me, even though I was a little late getting to it. Goodness gracious, I don't know how I missed it. This is right up my alley. But anyway, that is a reread tag. I'm going to do this again next year, see if things have changed. But in the meantime, I'm going to wrap this up. But I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.